Hello, everybody, and welcome to this 10 o'clock session for the LMEA Ready, Set, Go conference. We have with us a great presenter this morning from the Country Music Association Foundation, the executive director of the Country Music Association Foundation, Miss Tiffany Kerns, and she's going to talk with us this morning. Tiffany, go ahead and take it away, and you can share your slides, and we look forward to hearing from you this morning.
Awesome. Thank you so much, William. Well, good morning, everyone. First, I always like to just say thank you for taking time on your Saturday over the weekend to just, I guess, better prepare and better inform yourself so that way you can be incredible for your students. So just know I certainly appreciate the continued development that you are investing in yourself. As William mentioned, I'm the executive director of the CMA Foundation, and I have a very unique role. I think it's important to understand this context before we get started, but I have a very unique role in that I oversee the CMA Foundation, which is the charitable arm of CMA, or the Country Music Association. And because we are tethered and tied to CMA, I have this unique ability to have access to research on human behavior. We have a research team, an in-house research team, that is constantly looking at why people do certain things. Like we like to track behavior because we ultimately, as a business, want people to consume music. We want them to turn on their televisions and watch television shows that are ours. And I think that in order to do that, you have to understand what actually moves people to do certain things. And so after a few years of going to many MEA conferences and talking to educators all across the country, I always am very interested and intrigued when I walk into a classroom and I watch how teachers interact and I watch how students interact. And I'm doing it because I like to pay attention to their behaviors. I feel like when you really tuned into how and why students or people in general act the way that they do, you can leverage it to accomplish so much. And so I think for us, we carry a very unique opportunity to share this kind of information with you all. And so today's presentation is really understanding where we were before the pandemic in terms of how students were consuming information and where we are, amid the pandemic, during the pandemic. And certainly I want to point to some recent research that we learned this past week on YouTube consumption, which I'll talk about a little bit in this presentation. But ultimately, I want it to be interactive. I want you to ask questions. Even if I don't know the answer, I can tell you what at least I've been exposed to and where we might find additional information. So we'll just get started. So first, I want to talk about you because I think it's important to kind of level set. Students are humans. Teachers are humans. Administrators are humans. So we certainly have more in common than I think we realize. But I want you to ask yourself these three questions. And I really do want you to think about the answer. This is not just me throwing up a slide and you going, okay, I don't really have to engage in this, in these questions. It's really important that you answer these because I think we're going to have this full circle moment at the end when we realize that these are actually very similar to some other individuals. So why did you become an educator in the first place? What brings you joy in the classroom? And how has technology improved your life? And I really want you to think through those answers and even feel free to chat them if you'd like. But I do think it's super important for you to articulate, absorb, and be able to really answer these questions for yourself. So I'm just going to give you literally 30 seconds. Think through it. You don't need to over analyze this by any means, but really think through this. Oh, you all are too nice in the chat. Okay, we're going to come back to this. Now I want to start to understand your behavior and whether it's me understanding it or you understanding it for yourselves. I just want to pose a few questions. When you are watching television, do you utilize your cell phone and iPad? So do you immediately, while you're watching, you're multitasking, you're like, you know what, I'm going to check social media, or I'm going to check email. And be honest, I want to know, when you are watching television, do you utilize your cell phone and iPad? When scrolling through social media, ask yourself the question, how often am I stopping? And what am I watching? And how long am I watching it for? I think that this is always, anytime I look at our social data, I'm always just shocked at how much we're actually not really absorbing when it comes to social media, because we're not actually giving ourselves enough time for it to transfer from one side of the brain to the other. But really thinking through, like, when you're scrolling, how often are you even stopping to like truly watch something? Is there a theme? Is there like a sweet spot for you in terms of time? Is it short form? Is it long form? Do you believe you've deeply engaged in meaningful work via Zoom over the last 18, 19 months? And how many of you are, have access to your cell phone right now and are multitasking? Let's see, we are 3 minutes in, so that's pretty on point for someone to be able to pick up their phone or look at another screen or have a conversation with someone. It takes only about 3 minutes to do so. So be thinking about that. This is your behavior. And by the way, I hope as you're answering these questions, you're like, I should probably be thinking about this as I interact with our students as well. And by the way, you'll hear me refer to students as young people, children, youth quite a bit, because when we collect data, depending on where you're getting it from, everyone references students very differently. So just know I'm always talking about students anytime I'm talking about young people or youth, unless I say otherwise. So today's goal, from my perspective, and certainly, it can change if we decide it's going to change. We want to walk away understanding the behaviors of our students as a result of the pandemic. I think that we can certainly make assumptions, but there is actually data leading us to some really good information about behavior. We also need to remind each other that we represent people and we represent humans, not products. So their behaviors are going to change and they will always evolve. And so therefore we have to evolve, right? Like, that is any business that you go to, when, technology became this thing, we were like, all right, how do we utilize socials? How do we start turning on listening? So that way, anytime you say, I'm craving Chick-fil-A, and somehow it shows up on your feed, we play into those things. And so businesses are no different than how we should approach anything in life, right? It's paying attention to behavior and making sure that we're evolving to best meet the needs of people. And then equip ourselves with this information so we can leverage it for success. I certainly do not, I'm very cautious to use the word change versus evolve, because change sometimes makes people feel like something was wrong. And in reality, it's just our behaviors are constantly changing. And so we just have to make sure that we're paying attention to it. Otherwise, sometimes you can be left behind. So let's talk about pre-pandemic. And again, I want you to be thinking about, all right, how did I kind of consume information before? Did I feel like I was moving slower? Did I feel like I had more time to absorb information? Did I have the ability to pay attention in longer settings, long form versus short form? Again, just paying attention as we start to talk through these things about your own behavior. So pre-pandemic, 60% of parents said that their children spent no more than 3 hours on devices. And what is interesting about this study is the vast majority of devices really comes down to an iPad or an iPhone or a gaming console. What is interesting is that parents often didn't refer to as a computer or a laptop as a device. And I think that is telling about the generation difference between our young youth and our students, and obviously an older adult. Gaming, social media, and homework were among the top 3 types of content that our students were engaging in. And it was pretty consistent across all 3 of those. They were pretty much equally divided. We saw gaming interaction not be as long. So they may go into gaming for a short period of time. Social media, again, they didn't stay on it for hours. It was, I need to look at who is doing what, where, and then I'm ready to jump off. And then when it came to homework, we found that most students were engaging in what we would call search engine functions. So, doing research, those kinds of things, but actually engaging in a homework activity was not actually taking shape. But it was more or less doing research on something related to homework. And then, of course, I think that it's important to remember that Zoom was not a popular method of communicating among children 5 to 17. In fact, when we started to try to kind of learn the behaviors pre-pandemic about students, something that I think is really fascinating is there was less interest in doing group kind of setting interaction. They liked the idea of a one-on-one connection, maybe that they were also not even engaging in. So you think about YouTube influencers, for instance. Our young people just love listening, absorbing, and not necessarily interacting. And so, of course, Zoom then naturally, by sheer nature of what it is, it would not be popular among that group because that's not natural to them. The way that they are utilizing their devices is very different than the way we're utilizing our devices for connection. And so that's really, really important to think about as we think during pandemic, as we navigate, Microsoft Teams or whatever, platform you all were using in your schools. We were actually having students do something that was very new and not natural because that's not how their behaviors have led them to interact with their devices. So on average screen time, this is something that's really interesting. It's actually less about students and more about adults, although I would say that the sample size and the populations, the demographics that they were doing it in generation sample sizes. And really this stayed true for just about everyone, but the largest sample size, 17 to 55, I think. This stayed pretty accurate. And that's on average screen time while working or learning would result in 38 minutes of uninterrupted and limited to no distractions. So that means I can jump on this webinar. Imagine I am you on the other end listening to me speak, and I would be engaged last April for 38 minutes. And that is before I picked up something else or grabbed something or had a conversation with someone. I was really deeply engaged in 38 minutes. And then I might try to multitask. Then I might try to move to something else or take a note or whatever it is. But I share that because that piece of data has changed drastically. So during the pandemic, we started going, man, how do we, and again, selfishly, again, when I'm wearing my CMA hat, I'm constantly thinking about how students are consuming, how people are consuming. But certainly I'm very interested in how our young people are consuming anything. So we wanted to start understanding like, what is driving kind of their behavior? How do we meet them where they are to get them to do things like consume music, potentially turn on broadcast television, which by the way is very difficult to do if a parent is not the one to turn on the channel. But how do we get them to absorb some of these things on what I would call our for-profit side? Meanwhile, my foundation or my music education brain is thinking to myself, this is really interesting. And how can I share this information with our music teachers so they start thinking about how they're engaging in their work? So the sample size grew. And then 70% of the parents were saying, oh, they've definitely added an hour. And what I think is really interesting about this during pandemic research is that they were no longer really identifying that their students or their children were spending 4 hours on their devices specific to homework. That actually started to kind of leave their brains about how students were interacting with devices. So when we started asking what are they accessing? I mean, homework and schoolwork started to really not show up at all. So that means that before they were like, yeah, my student, my child accesses their device and they're, they're doing that search engine activity where they're trying to find out information in order to complete their homework. Parents were starting to see that their children were starting to interact with technology in a very different way. And it wasn't even specific to school. Did those hours include classes they were required? So it's interesting. When we look at these questions, we used the word engage quite a bit. And I don't think that parents felt that their students were engaging in class time that were virtual. So we really had to, and to keep in mind, anytime you're doing research, a lot of it's subjective and how someone reads it or whatever. But we did find it to be fascinating that they stopped including when we said, where and what are they doing on their devices? They were not mentioning anything to do with school. And so I share that with you, not because I know what to do with it per se, but I share that with you because when we talk about engaging meaningfully, we really started to see a shift during the pandemic. Something that was fascinating to us is gaming increased among all of the other content areas. So as I mentioned before, they were spending equal amount of time gaming, social media, doing research. Gaming just started to really take over. And I think I was thinking about this as I was driving into the office this morning. And I started to think about, okay, wait, why would that kind of be the case? And if you think about it, social media has this function of, in theory, showing people what someone else is doing. Well, during the pandemic, we were quarantining. There wasn't a ton to show individuals. And so when you work in isolation, one of the best things that you can do in isolation is game, right? So we started to see this really big insurgence of students that were going, you know what, I'm actually going to participate in gaming because I can do it. I can do it in isolation. I can still kind of remain connected, but stay a little bit removed. And so we really just started seeing the student behavior change quite a bit. And this also increased among all ages, 5 to 17. So this wasn't just, it's a very specific age group, 5 to 8 or 8 to 12. I mean, we really started to see this across the entire demographic. And then the other thing that was also really interesting is that children consume from their perspective, all of their media from a single device. So when we started looking at millennial and Gen X data, we absolutely talk about multiple devices. We talk about a phone, we talk about an iPad, we talk about a computer, but we definitely talk about a wide variety of devices. When we interact with our young people, they only talk about this. Their phone really is the cornerstone to kind of how they are absorbing information, consuming it, but also, putting it out. And so I do think it's important, again, just a nugget to think about. There isn't like this incredible thing I'm going to tell you to do with your phones or encourage you to do with your students' phones. But I always think that if I can present the data that we are constantly dealing with and seeing, then you can make or think about figuring out how you can evolve your programs or how you interact with students based on knowing this information. And I'm happy to, if it's helpful, tell you how we use this information to kind of meet the needs of students specific to our CMA side. And of course, please ask questions. Andy, thank you so much for posing that question. Ask questions. I do not expect all of you to understand this information. I am exposed to it constantly. So if I'm speaking at too high of a level or you need me to dive into any specific data set, please let me know. I'm certainly happy to do that. So We know this, teachers, you all know this better than anyone, but behavioral changes as a result of the pandemic included stress disorders, exhaustion, irritability, insomnia, poor concentration. And again, when we start to think about how we started to interact in isolation, those are results of that. And so I think about, I was actually talking to a very good friend of mine yesterday, and we were talking about how irritability, just how, whether you are flying or you are in traffic, just this, like, everyone just seems very irritable. And when you think about sitting in isolation, sitting in quarantine, you are essentially doing everything that you want to do. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with any one of us, by the way. This is stuff that comes very natural. But you have to just remember that whether we even recognize it or not, our behavior's changed. And so, of course, we are going to be a bit more crazed when we come out of quarantine, when we come out of isolation and start to try to just have human connection again. There are going to be very normal things we will experience until we can start to train our behavior to adapt. And so know that anytime I see someone that's really irritable, I'm like, oh my goodness, like they are absolutely feeling the impact of, being really in quarantine, through the pandemic. Now, I always try to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. That is not going to necessarily be the case for everyone all the time, but we certainly have more in common when it comes to human behavior right now than I think we ever have as a society. So it's something to just keep in mind in the back of your brain. And then on average screen time while learning or working would result in 3 minutes. So remember we talked about 38 minutes just 2-3 slides ago. It's now 3 minutes. So before someone even gets done with, their bio or their introduction, you have already picked up your phone. Now we are also seeing this, as I mentioned, that 38 minutes, that rang very true for adults and students. Sure, they could be a little bit more they could go 38 minutes, but they were more likely to pick up their phone at any given time because they're so used to technology being an appendage. So it's not odd for them to always have this. But certainly when you think about millennials or Gen X, like that's not natural for us because we actually lived in a world where those things weren't at our fingertips, the entire time we've been alive. So that's something that's really interesting. It's something that I've made sure to share anytime we give presentations at CMA. I'm always like, how are we spending the first 3 minutes of our time? How do we make sure we give good context? We actually have started saying at the very top of all presentations, this is what we hope to get out of it. So you can see what, we're going to be talking about and hopefully absorbing and making decisions right then and there, how you're going to engage and how long we might actually have you as part of the presentation. But it's really important to pay attention to this number because this is not just your students. This is also you. And so when you think about re-engaging with your students or with young people, that's something to keep in mind is, are you modeling behavior that you ultimately want your students to absorb? How can you influence or change the behavior of your students by just, modeling it? I think is something that's super important to also understand. Let me just look at what Brett posted. Yeah, you are completely correct, Brett. I think that one of the things we've been really pushing, just so you know, the Department of Education on is making sure that we're paying attention to this data. I think in education, historically speaking, it takes forever for us to actually see data in real time. If you go to the entertainment side of the business, we will do research in June and have it July 1. And that is because we have to be in the moment, changing and thinking about human behavior. And it's certainly not going to be foolproof all of the time. We know that, but that's research, by the way. But I think for us, if we are not figuring out how we interact with people present day, not what were their behaviors and then what did we end up doing years later because of it. We need to figure out how we can start moving people to do the things we want them to do. And so I say that because think of any for-profit company you interact with, just know they are, this is why they want all of that information on you on your phone, because they want to learn your behavior so they can either make your life easier or sell you more things or whatever it is. But it is, I know a lot of people think it's so intrusive, but truly the reason, the motivation behind it is I want to know your every move so I can figure out how to reach you exactly where you are. They are truly not doing anything that you're not trying to do typically with students, which is where are you and how do I get there? And so always something to keep in mind. Anytime someone's asking for that information, data allows us to make better choices on behalf of the constituents we serve without them recognizing or realizing it. Doesn't mean that I'm always in support of it, but I do think it's reminding yourself that there are so many reasons to be data driven. And again, I'm very mindful that we interact with people. And so, yes, data is great, but also just remembering that humans evolve at a rapid pace and at rapid speed all the time. And so data should just help inform, but it is not the end all be all. Will never be the end all be all. So I think YouTube is one of the most interesting platforms that exist for a variety of reasons, because anytime we see young people interact with YouTube, I just, continue to feel real old, but I also just, I cannot get over how much information is being absorbed there, right? When I go to, when I think about Facebook or Instagram or any social media, you're constantly looking at others are kind of giving you information. And certainly if you follow certain brands or companies, they can populate your feed with information. The thing that I find interesting with YouTube is how they are testing. And I'll kind of go into, I'll give you a few examples. It is truly just such a fascinating platform. First of all, the fact that 77% of 15 to 35-year-olds in the US use YouTube is incredible. That statistic is far larger than any other platform. It kills Facebook by a long shot. Same thing with Instagram, which now they're kind of tying together. TikTok even. It is insane how much, how large the demographic span is that YouTube captures. And I think that the reason for that is obviously content, right? Video is king, truly. The amount, please know that. If you are trying to get your students to do anything, please utilize video. I am telling you, when we are looking at data and seeing how video actually changes behavior, it is truly mind-boggling. But the thing that I think is really interesting, and this is supposed to be 13 through 17, is that 85% of our teenagers are using YouTube. And so when you think about, I often now, anytime I'm interacting with someone that's young, I'm like, what's the latest that you've watched on YouTube? I actually don't even let them tell me that, YouTube is the platform. I just go ahead and make myself sound real cool and say, what are you watching on YouTube? They're absorbing, this generation is more likely to absorb music videos. They're more likely to watch tutorials. They're more likely to be taught, which is super crazy because millennials and Gen Xers, we are not that way actually, in terms of behavior. Of course, you might be that data set that's way over here. But I mean, the fact that they are utilizing it for everything, it is truly fascinating and something that we've been really mindful of. There's also specific algorithms within YouTube. So if someone, engages in a certain kind of music, Spotify and Pandora are a little bit like this too, but then they try really, really hard to make sure that algorithm is constantly feeding you things that you want to see, right? And the other thing that's really interesting is that they're making connections to, okay, if you're a music consumer, they're also making connections to, well, you're more likely to be interested in the launch of a film. And because they know that, they tie those things into the algorithm. And so we've actually been playing around a lot with, are there things that students are learning? Are there things that adults are learning on YouTube where we can start to tie in country music? I'm speaking again on behalf of kind of that for-profit side. But if you've never asked your students what they're watching on YouTube, what they're learning on YouTube, you should. And the reason being is they can tell you a lot about what their interests are. And I think it's important anytime I walk into a room, I always like to know, who am I speaking to? What drives them? What makes them happy? What brings them joy? And ultimately, like, where are they finding information? Who are trusted resources? When you know all of those things, you can leverage it to have better and greater relationships with the people in the room. And so I just encourage you to really think about YouTube as a information hub for you, because it is fascinating, the things you can learn. The other thing that is very different, that we, again, are paying close attention to, is that teenagers are finding YouTube influencers more relatable than traditional celebrities. That's not that shocking. What is shocking is that they are finding them to be more celebrity. And so I think for us, it's important to pay attention to, again, who is influencing our young, who are the influencers for our young people, because they're not necessarily the ones that are on television or producing music. They may in fact be individuals that you've never really heard of. We're also, I should mention, because I didn't put it in a slide, but TikTok is kind of starting to share those similar behaviors. You have TikTok influencers, you have YouTube influencers. Students are really starting to be captivated by individuals they either respect or see themselves in, or want to imagine themselves interacting with, versus a celebrity, untouchable, unobtainable, aspirational is even leaving a bit. So again, watching these behaviors shift is really interesting. So YouTubers do have an influence on the behavior of teenagers. I kind of just alluded to that. Please, if there is anything that you take out of this presentation, I really believe that this slide is one that I would just encourage all of you to just level set, data set, assess what and where your students are learning, because I do think it is really, really key. And when we say learning, obviously we mean it in a very academic setting, but that's not always the case. Learning for a child is just learning, how to interact with a human, put on makeup. I mean, you name it, you can watch it on YouTube and or on TikTok. And so paying attention to those things, I think is truly really important. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Because I definitely want to make sure that I leave time for questions, and I want to be mindful that you all have a very busy day with really, really good sessions. It means that students do not know a world without technology. I know we have said this many times, and I've heard it in many rooms, but do we actually teach that way? Do we teach really believing that students do not know a world without technology? That is an appendage. And when I say technology, I don't even mean music technology. How are you utilizing it in your classroom? I just mean thinking about how students are engaging with human interaction or digital interaction outside of your classroom has an impact on your classroom, period. And so just remember that it really is an appendage. Our young people do not know a world without it. And even if they haven't had access to it, they still don't know a world where it doesn't exist. And so it's really important to pay attention to that. Analyze where, how, and who your students are learning from, and then figuring out ways to leverage it. If ever you're not sure how to leverage it, call me. Send me a note. I can tell you how to leverage the heck out of the information you're absorbing. But it will allow you to look at your student and or students, plural, and really find ways that your teaching can match their behavior, but also how you can model the behavior that you want to see kind of drive theirs. And so I am telling you, there are so many things that I believe can be utilized and leveraged when you ask the right questions. And then I said this at the top, and I will say it again. Evolving teaching practices does not mean you're abandoning a traditional way of teaching or the right way, right? If I truly think about in my role here, I've been at CMA now for 8 years. I don't do one thing the same, not one, because I can't. Behaviors have changed. If I did, I would be incredibly outdated. I would not be meeting the needs of the people that depend on me. I would no longer be effective. I've constantly had to say, all right, how am I evolving? Because people are evolving and time has evolved. And how are we mindful that the way in which we interact with each other truly has evolved versus trying really, really hard to make it be the same. I think about the music business specifically, to give you an example. You know, we were in a lot of conversations during the pandemic, like, man, the minute that we open back up, like we're gonna go back out and we're gonna start touring again, and you know, we're gonna go back to normal. Well, I think that's very naive, right? Because people are different. And you all are hearing that constantly. You all are feeling that constantly because you are watching that change in our young people. You are seeing it. And so the one thing that the music business kind of started to, I think, really change in the last probably 5 months is we just started asking ourselves questions like, okay, but do we want it to go back that way? Like, were we really happy before the way the music business looked? And is now a time to really think about how we want to implement, you know, these changes? There's no time better than when, you know, crisis happened and forced all of us outside of a comfort zone to really go, you know what? I'm going to start something a little bit different. I'm going to actually ask my students different questions. I want to engage with them differently. Because if I'm not paying attention to how they're evolving, and by the way, we're going to evolve at a rapid pace now. So, because again, we opened the floodgates and now people are back in and everyone is interacting in a different way. You have some people that are still quarantining and working in isolation. You have companies that aren't open. You have companies that are. You have concerts that are happening, concerts with masks. Like, everybody is going to be absorbing and evolving at a rapid pace. And so keeping that in mind as you all go back into classrooms, you're not walking back into a classroom that looked the way it did in May. You're not walking back into a classroom that looked the way it did last March. You are getting to walk into a classroom and deciding what you want it to look like moving forward. And so I do think that really going, man, how do I own this differently? Because we are just going to be more likely to step right into the behavior that is being asked of us versus fighting it when it comes to the classroom. I've already seen it within our own organization. Like, hey, this is how it's going to change. And yes, you may have some that are really reluctant. We have really late, I always say, for me, even technology, I'm very late to the game always. And so I like to look around, absorb, figure my way out, get really comfortable. But that's happening a little bit faster now. I'm like, yeah, okay, get in, get comfortable. Great, you're good. Let's move forward. So just know that this idea of talking through evolution, we're going to be more open to it as a society than we ever have been. Now, I say that I recognize that some of you may be on the other end of this computer screen going, Tiffany, you're clearly not involved in vaccination conversations, mask conversations. It's very different human behavior, by the way, for a variety of reasons that I don't care to get into today. But we study that behavior too, and that behavior really does flood from a typically a lack of information, consistent communication, and all of those things. So the other thing that I would tell you too is anything that you are absorbing, make sure you communicate, right? Communicate. The reason that this pandemic has really been hard for the vast majority of people is lack of communication or effective communication. And that's something that I think we've all learned. And so probably even within your own school system, right? So really, really be thinking about, okay, moving forward, I want to over communicate. I want to make sure that everyone knows everything at any given time and can ask questions, and that I can say, no, I don't have the answer to that, because it's constantly evolving. Getting really comfortable with that. I know as teachers, we always like to have the answers. And that's just not going to be the case for a minute. We're all going to need to give each other grace and call out, name it, say it. I don't have all of the answers, but I'm going to try really, really hard to make sure that the end result is that our students are learning and that they're successful, and we have that in common. Find that commonality and communicate the heck out of it. That was me going on a tangent, because communication is like, man, it is quintessential to everything that we do. So now I want to give you an opportunity to ask me questions, because I threw a lot of data at you. And even Sharon, I love that you mentioned how, you could potentially be using it, and not just you, but all teachers. So I would love to know how you all might equip yourselves or utilize this information to also make you a better teacher for your students. I would just love to know that information. And if there's any data points that you know of that I didn't talk or speak to, certainly I'm always interested in what you're seeing or feeling or hearing or taking part in your own communities. Certainly any of the data that I've shared has been like kind of broad in terms of, we went to a sample size, brought everyone together, asked these questions. And so just know that it's not necessarily representative of every single human, but you start to see those trends, and those trends start to, I think, really inform you on how you can move forward. All right, give me some questions, y'all. I'm so proud of myself, for the record, Brett and William, that I was able to do this in 43 minutes, because that's a record for me. I love to talk. Okay. Oh, that's a really good question, Eric. Okay, I've encountered students that are very tech savvy until it's time to remember their smart music login info, turn in virtual assignment, or submit virtual playing test. I've done tutorials and modeling practice with my students. Do you have any other suggestions on how I might be able to reach my students to encourage them to participate? Yes, so you raise a really fascinating point, and I don't know that I have an answer, but I'm just gonna say a few things out loud. So I think that when we think of interacting with YouTube, with Facebook, with socials, with gaming, it's all turnkey. It's very easy. They get to have their phone out or their gaming device or whatever, and everything's kind of stored in there, right? Just like, think about you when you purchase something. I'm more likely to give a donation on Facebook because they remember all of that information versus text to give, which I then have to take out my credit card for. So it comes down to convenience. And by the way, we all operate that way. And so what you're speaking to is turn on the virtual assignment, submit virtual playing tests. Like, when you think about, it's not turnkey, right? And so those things just, it is not it forces us to not be lazy. And those things just require a lot more patience in getting the students to interact. When we think about the other side of technology, all of that stuff is like lazy engagement. I wouldn't call it great engagement. It's lazy engagement. It's just very easy, turnkey. They can do it. So what I would say is, and I am saying this all wrong, so you brilliant teachers, think about it in whatever way you can kind of shape this and give it the correct narrative. But I would find ways to make it a bit turnkey. I wouldn't take out all of the non-turnkey stuff, because that is really important in engaging students. But I would certainly try really, really hard to figure out ways to make it turnkey, because that's what their behavior, that's what they're used to, right? And I know that I always have conversations where I'm like, don't fight against this. Like, don't go, well, I'm going to teach them. I'm going to teach them. Force feeding anyone is never going to work. And for whatever reason, we really see it not working in technology at all. And so instead it's maybe trying to find commonalities between the thing where they are on things. So saying, I noticed that you can't remember this password, but somehow you're remembering all of your social passwords, all of your anything else you're doing on, and why is that? And let them articulate it back to you. Why not ask them? And let them start engaging with you and kind of human dialogue, and verse it being around frustration. Because I will also say frustration meets frustration. The minute you walk into a store and someone is frustrated and they give you a bad experience, you hit them back with frustration. It takes a really solid person to hit them back with kindness. This is just the nature of our being. Like, we have to be really mindful and really intentional in our behaviors. And so ask those questions of your students. Try to get them to engage in that way. And of course, again, I know I'm making it sound super easy because you all are interacting with students all the time that are not doing what you want them to do. But start asking those questions. Like, is there something that this could do that would make, is there something in the way that I'm teaching that could be better? Talk to me, engage with me, tell me. And that's where I think you can ask, like, when you're on YouTube, when you're on your gaming device, like, how do you interact? How do you engage? What excites you? And then figure out ways that, are you just not teaching at all in the way in which they absorb? Or is there just been miscommunication at some point? And I think we make too many assumptions about the individuals we serve, and we've got to just start asking questions. I really think that that's important. Now they have to go deeper. Yeah, I think you're right, Sharon. I know. I too need a binder, though. I have a fancy app that reminds me of every password that I have because I can't remember them. They make me change them too often. So, but again, even for me, I'm likely to engage more if it's turnkey, if it's easy. We are just, as a society, more inclined to do that. And so anything that forces us to think, truly outside of gaming, I can't figure out how gaming has somehow mastered that. I really do think that we have to just find ways to have stronger conversations around behavior. I thank you all so much for your time. And certainly Brett knows how to get in touch with me. William knows how to get in touch with me. Any of you are more than welcome to call me, email me, text me at any time. If you have questions, concerns, you want help in figuring out how to better reach your students, I'm happy to always be of service in any way that I can, and know that you all are doing incredible work. And I'm so thankful for the commitment that you all have in your classrooms and to your teachers. It really is awe-inspiring, and it makes me so proud to work with and on behalf of music teachers all over the country. So thank you for that. Anything else? Cool. Well, thank you all so much. Have a great rest of the day and enjoy yourselves. William, are you closing this out, or am I just hanging up?
I got you covered. Great job. We'll see everybody at your next session. Y'all have a great day.